Hello, everyone. I am Mohammad Tavakkoli, the director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to another inspiring and rather timely session of our bi-weekly Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali seminar series, Women Poets, which I am co-convening with Professor Azita Talagani and Professor Rivan Sandler. At the outset, I'd like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and prosper on their ancestral homeland. I would like to welcome Professor Zuzanna Olszewska of the University of Oxford to the University of Toronto. My colleague, Professor Rivan Sandler, will be introducing Professor Olszewska and will moderate today's session on Daughters of Rabi'ah, Afghan women poets in the digital age. Professor Sandler.
Thank you, Mohammed, Dr. Tavakkoli. It is my pleasure to introduce someone that I just met, but who I have read about among other things in her very interesting website biography. And I unfortunately can only give a brief introduction, but it was with great interest that I read everything. Zuzanna Olszewska is an associate professor in the social anthropology of the Middle East at the University of Oxford. She specializes in the ethnography of Iran and Afghanistan, with a focus on Afghan refugees in Iran, the Persian-speaking Afghan diaspora, and the anthropology of literature and cultural production. She received her doctorate in social anthropology from the University of Oxford and has held post-doctoral fellowships at St. John's College and the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her doctoral research was published as The Pearl of Dari, Poetry and Personhood Among Young Afghans in Iran, and that was published by Indiana University Press in 2015. This work won the 2016 Hushainpur Shariati Iranian Studies Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association. Her longtime research on Afghan cultural production expands beyond the refugee community in Iran to take a more global approach, examining the effective and imaginative role of Afghan diasporic communities are playing in creating or thwarting an elusive Pan-Afghan national identity. She is particularly interested in how young emigre Afghans use new social media and both offline and online cultural activities to construct an Afghan national imaginary or other identities. So it is with great pleasure that I turn the podium over to Professor Olszewska, who will enlighten us about Daughters of Rabi'ah, Afghan women poets in the digital age. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Tavakoli, Professor Sandler, for your kind words and for your invitation to speak to you all this evening. Thank you also to the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies, Dr. Arshavez Muzaffari, Dr. Azita Talaghani, and the rest of the team that helped this event to take place. I'm very grateful for you, to you all for this opportunity. So between my initial planning of this talk and its delivery today, as you all know, a series of cataclysmic events have unfolded in Afghanistan, and that can't be far from the minds of many of you who are listening. So rather than a survey of the past 20 years of Afghan women's poetry that I'd planned, my focus has shifted recently to the aftermath of the Taliban takeover of the country, to the online networks of Afghan women poets, and in particular the work of one poet who has been very active in this time, and I think illustrates many of the other themes that I wanted to talk to you about. So because I'll be drawing fairly broad brushstrokes, and as an anthropologist focusing on the social context of poetry, I hope you'll forgive me for those of you who are literary scholars and used to maybe more close readings or interpretations of the poems. I won't be doing as much of that, perhaps. I'll have to leave that for other occasions. But this work has been ongoing for a very long time. It's originated in ethnographic research with Afghan refugee literary organizations in Iran between 2005 and 2010. And since then, ongoing digital ethnography with Afghan poets and intellectuals from the global diaspora in subsequent years. Right, well, where to start? I think I'll start with the fact that poetry is a slippery thing. It enables the poet to express her innermost thoughts while hiding behind layers of convention and metaphor. It reveals even as it conceals, and the poet must maintain a delicate tension between these two acts. That tension is all the more delicate in the case of Afghan women, for whom abiding by traditional distinctions between appropriate behavior in public and private carries dramatically higher stakes than it does for men, although men, of course, have to worry about it a little bit too. It can be particularly risky for women to stand somewhat apart from society and speak some of its unspoken truths, such as the reality of romantic love, for example. And despite these challenges, poetry is an art that women of what is today Afghanistan have been pursuing and were already pursuing at the dawn of recorded Persian literature in the 10th century. But women have always had to be particularly judicious in balancing creative expression with safeguarding their honor and upholding public moral codes. History itself, the sort of written history, recorded history, has also not been very kind to Afghan women poets. Few female names have come down to us in the classical canon, and only a few more in contemporary times. Today, many Afghans remember the chilling legend of the first recorded female poet of the Persian language, Rabi'ah, from the title of my talk, Rabi'ah of Balkh, a noble woman who was murdered by her own brother for the crime of falling in love with a slave back in the 10th century. And she's said to have written her last poem with her own blood on the door of the bathhouse, in which she was left to die with bleeding to death, having had her throat cut. But fewer people, unfortunately, remember the remarkable women of the Timurid era in Herat. That dynasty yielded not only the powerful Queen Gohar Shah, one of the instigators of Herat's 15th century cultural renaissance, but also many other aristocratic ladies who were active patrons of architecture, music, painting, and literature, or were themselves notable poets. The literary soirees of Mir-Ali Shir Navai, a courtier of the 15th century Sultan Hossein Boyqara, were famous for their refined, witty banter, verbal virtuosity, and extemporaneous poetic composition. And female as well as male poets participated in them. In Afghanistan's vibrant oral tradition, of course, women have been composers of folk poetry on a par with men, even if their verbal performances traveled less far, perhaps, than those of men. Even in the 20th century, among increasingly secular and educated urban dwellers, the tradition continued. And Zohra Saed, an Afghan-born poet who lives in the United States and writes poetry in English, described it beautifully in the introduction to a volume of Afghan women's poetry. Quote, while the majority of our grandmothers could not read or write, they learned classical and modern Dari poetry through the rich oral tradition and passed it down to their children. Our kitchen was always buzzing with gossip and poetry, religion and fairy tales, philosophy and recipes, end quote. Even well-known male poets often speak of the powerful influence their mothers' lullabies or stories had on their awareness of the magical music of words. There are some genres of folk poetry that are strongly associated with women, such as the Mashhad, the elegy or lament sung by women in times of mourning among the Hazaras, and the Landé of the Pashtuns, but women compose or perform in many other oral genres too. Now, of course, I can't cover all of this rich history today, so I'm planning to focus specifically on some selected aspects of the Persian language poetry of the past 20 years, bookended by the fall of the Taliban in 2001 and their return in 2021, this year, of course. In the second half, I'm going to focus in greater depth on the life and work of one poet, Mahbouba Ibrahimi. Trying to get to my next slide. There we go. So I'll be talking about these three poets, but focusing in particular on Mahbouba's work. Mahbouba's craft was forged as a refugee in Iran, but she later returned for a short time to Afghanistan and then, like many of her peers, soon remigrated to a third country, a European country. So in the first years following the fall of the Taliban in 2001, there was an atmosphere of excitement and optimism in what was seen as a cultural rebirth after the harsh restrictions of the theocratic regime, which had banned poetry and music. Even during those years, however, women had attended underground schools and literary gatherings. Something of women's hunger for literature and knowledge is seen in the voracious reading habits of one budding young poet during Taliban times. Quote, she studied the poetry of Sa'di, Hafiz of Shiraz, Maulana of Balkh, Rumi, of course, Bidal of Delhi, Mehdi Sohaili, Sohrab Sepehri, Nimoy Shij, Feridun Mushiri, Furuq Farrokhzad, Parveen Etisami, Ahar Asi, and the novels of Jalal Ahmad, Sadiq Hidayat, Fahimi Rahimi, and Nasrin Samani, all famous classical and contemporary writers from across the Persian-speaking world. At the same time, editing the literary works of the other young writers from the Herat Literary Association and household chores were all part of her daily routine. And this precocious young woman was Nadia Anjuman, one of the rising stars of poetry in Herat, pictured on the left there. She was able to study Dari literature officially at Herat University after 2001 and published her first book, Gule Dudi, Smoky or Dark Flower, to great acclaim in 2005. She was hailed for introducing a fresh language and youthful point of view into Dari poetry, particularly in her ghazals. And she once described her poetic work, quote, for as long as I can remember, I've loved poetry, and the chains with which 6 years of captivity under Taliban rule bound my feet led me to haltingly enter the arena of poetry with the foot of my pen. The encouragement of like-minded friends gave me the confidence to pursue this path. But even now, when I take the first step, the tip of my pen trembles, as do I, because I do not feel safe from stumbling on this path when the way ahead is difficult and my steps unsteady, end quote. Excuse me. Now, in this poem of hers that I translated in blank verse, I'm going to be reading out just the English, and the Persian is on the left for anyone who would like to read along. So in this poem, she writes about an encounter that she had with some nomadic women who had walked into Herat and who she imagined as among the most destitute of her compatriots. A voiceless cry. The sound of green footsteps is the rain. They're coming in from the road now, thirsty souls and dusty skirts brought from the desert, their breath burning, mirage mingled, mouths dry and caked with dust. They're coming in from the road now, tormented, girls brought up on pain. Joy departed from their faces, hearts old and lined with cracks. No smile appears on the bleak oceans of their lips. Not a tear springs from the dry rivers of their eyes. O God, might I not know if their voiceless cries reach the clouds, the vaulted heavens? The sound of green footsteps in the rain is the rain. And that poem was written by her in 2002 and published in her first volume. Now, I traveled to Herat in 2007 and interviewed poets there. And at the time, many acknowledged that in the previous few years, there had been a blossoming of women's poetry, with a large number of young women taking up the pen. One young poet, who was a man actually, said, quote, "In the past, if there were female poets in Herat, unfortunately, there were followers of great poets who were men. But gradually, we're witnessing the emergence of a number of women who are just themselves. They don't try to imitate any other poet, at least not an Afghan man. They try to create specifically women's poetry from now on." I missed a bit. The prominence of Furugh is one of the factors that has led them to turn to themselves and to try to create specifically women's poetry from now on, end quote. And he was referring, of course, to Furugh Farrokhzad, the celebrated Iranian modernist poet whose work in the mid-20th century represented a milestone for female expression of intimate emotions, including eroticism and sexuality, in free verse, and continues to be well loved today, both in Iran and in Afghanistan. Sumaya Ramesh, another poet I spoke to, who's just 22 at the time, later went on to become a member of the Provincial Council of Herat, a director of a cultural organization called No Andishan, and later also obtained a PhD in Persian literature from Delhi University in India. And at the time, she was obviously still very young, but very outgoing and optimistic about the level of literary activity around her in Herat, as she called it, the cradle of civilization and culture. And she saw poetry as a form of rebellion and social protest, but she complained of certain hindrances. One was the gap between generations and styles. She said, quote, "There is nobody to encourage young people. The great poets prefer classical styles, but not the younger ones. They prefer new poetry and blank verse. That's why there have been some conflicts," end quote. There were also difficulties specific to women in the form of traditional values that they had to confront. And she said, "There have always been barriers for Afghan women in any area, in writing too. Women cannot speak their minds. That fear still exists. For example, they still cannot write erotic poetry. Nobody would accept that here. Perhaps some do write it, but nobody has found the courage to read it out." Now, Khalida Furugh, another Afghan, one of the most leading, actually, female poets of Afghanistan, who became a professor of literature at Kabul University after spending some time in Pakistan as a refugee, agreed. She said, "A literary woman finds herself confronting the morality, religion, and traditions of Afghanistan society. And thus, it's much rarer for her to achieve full maturity as a writer. In most cases, these difficulties result in self-censorship. That is to say, a woman poet cannot express her feelings with the same directness as a man, even when he's writing about taboo subjects. This has happened to me time and again. When I've wanted to express myself in this way, I've either been unable to, or have had to change the subject according to what was morally and socially expedient." So there's a picture of Khalida in the middle there. And then, I thought I had a poem from her. I unfortunately don't know where that slide has gone to. Sorry, skipping ahead a bit. Here it is. Just slightly misplaced in my slideshow. Okay, so this is another poem from her that I translated, just a fragment, unfortunately, because it's quite long, but this is the beginning. "Always 5 in the afternoon. The purple lines carve into my gaze pointlessly. With a pen that is a cloud, they take my words and break them syllable by syllable so that I may not read a single verse of love. They've cut off my voice. Though bloody, though wounded, I will be recorded on love's cardiogram. But hopelessness is stronger yet. My steps are not familiar with moving forward, and movement is the unforgivable sin of the age. They've always advised my mirror to sit and break and be silent." Now, Khalida Furugh, at least, married into a family of poets who understood her endeavors, but many female poets were not so lucky. The generation of girls who bravely defied Taliban orders to attend clandestine writing workshops, the famous sewing circles of Herat, eventually married and one by one fell silent, ironically, after the defeat of the Taliban. So the social conservatism, in a way, defeated them in a way that when they were younger and unencumbered in that way, they had actually been free to attend clandestine poetry circles. And poets in Herat mentioned several women whose writing careers were threatened or cut short by marriage. One example was Nadia Anjuman. She faced severe restrictions from her in-laws and died in murky, rather unexplained circumstances after a dispute with her husband in 2005. Aged only 25, she left behind her first book of poetry and a baby boy. Thousands of fans and sympathizers attended her funeral in Herat, and her work continues to be popular in Persian-speaking countries among young people of both genders today. So, ultimately, at least by the mid-2000s, 2010s, the record of there was this effervescence of young women participating in poetic activities in Afghanistan. There was a lot of funding. There were organizations, cultural organizations were springing up. And importantly, there was no censorship officially in the country, at least, although the self-censorship and the social conservatism that we've heard about really continued to exert an influence in what they could write and what they could read out in which circles. Afghan women in exile fared somewhat better. Some who were already established writers before the war began fled to Western countries and continued their work there, although separated from a literary milieu in their mother tongue. Some of them nonetheless achieved acclaim for their work, such as the short story writer Spojmai Zariob, who's lived in France since 1991, and the poet Shakila Azizadeh, who lives in the Netherlands and writes poetry in Persian and in Dutch. In contrast, those Persian speakers who grew up in Iran, and obviously there was a very large Afghan refugee population in Iran, numbering several million, so they found themselves in a very dynamic literary scene in their own language. That language was living and changing, as were its poetic forms. And in addition, the perhaps unexpected benefit of Iran was that its public sphere had been turned into an Islamic space and was therefore considered more wholesome by their families. Large numbers of Afghan refugee girls, as a result, were able to be educated in Iran, and many became involved in literature. And so this was the topic of my, so I'm going to have to skip back, unfortunately, through some, there we go. This was the topic of my doctoral work and my book, The Pearl of Dari, my work with the Dore Dari Cultural Institute in Mashhad, whose members included approximately at least 50% women. There were more young women than older women, and many of the senior poets were still men, but you could definitely tell that a generational push and a generational shift was on its way. So as the 40 years of conflict in Afghanistan passed through successive stages and years of exile turned into decades, obviously new literary themes, genres, and protagonists emerged in relation to the political and cultural developments in diverse diasporic communities. I can't survey them all here, obviously, but most notably, the widespread access to education for both boys and girls in many refugee communities brought about a revolution of literacy and the broadening of writing, readership, and publication, first in print and later online. In Iran, for example, there were three distinct moments in refugee poetic production: the resistance poetry of the 1980s, the post-ideological poetry of the 1990s onwards, and the social media poetry of the 2010s onwards, very roughly sort of typologized by myself, with obviously a lot of overlap between these three broad time periods. And these moments reflected wider socio-political transformations in whose forges new genres were shaped. I unfortunately don't have a huge amount of time to go into that, but I've written about that in my book. Suffice it to say, I think that this post-ideological poetry of the 1990s turned back after the war poetry of the 1980s of both Iran and also the Afghan refugee communities, their respective wars. In the 1990s, people turned back to more personal and particularistic themes and genres, including a major shift back to the lyrical and confessional modernist blank verse, or sort of neoclassical genres like the neoclassical ghazal, which had developed largely in Iran earlier in the 20th century. So social media poetry can be either highly political or intensely personal and draws on these earlier strands in a literary moment that continues to be very experimental and eclectic and transcends borders. I mean, there's so much overflow across the Iran-Afghanistan border that it's very difficult to separate out that movement, other than to say that, of course, Iran is perhaps socially less conservative, but has official censorship, whereas Afghanistan is the opposite. There's no censorship in terms of publication of books and so on, but there's more social conservatism and self-censorship. So it's this last category, the social media poetry and its most recent expressions in particular, that I'm going to turn now. So in the mid to late 2000s, many Afghan poets and writers, especially those based in Iran, turned their hands to blogging. At the time, writers of Persian language blogs, known as weblogs in Persian, formed one of the biggest blogging communities in the world. I'm sure many of you here know this. Blogs were tightly interconnected since users could publicly follow each other's work and often requested reciprocity when doing so. So you'd be listed as a follower on the blog. And users actively commented on each other's latest posts within hours of them appearing. It's a very active and dynamic community. And the younger Afghan poets in Iran, but also in Afghanistan, were also avid users of instant messaging platforms in the early 2000s and regularly chatted with large personal networks of friends across Iran, Afghanistan, and the wider diaspora, many of whom they'd never met in person. So the befriending also took place online. And eventually, in the 2010s, Facebook quickly rose in popularity as a single platform that enabled all of these features: publishing, commenting, networking, and messaging. While in the late 2010s, many users also created Instagram accounts, and some became more active on that platform. Telegram is also a major app, which I don't have time to go into today, but it's also a sort of a big site of online digital literary sociality. So at the same time as these other apps became more widely used, new activity on most blogs died down at around the same time, though many old ones are still online and available to read. Access to Facebook and Instagram in Iran is restricted, but most users have ways to get around these blocks called filter shekan or filter breakers. And elsewhere in the world, of course, access is far easier, unimpeded. So although the move to social media was spearheaded by younger poets, eventually the older, more established poets who initially scorned it realized that they would be left behind and seen as out of touch if they didn't also establish a presence there. So at the core group of Afghan poets in Iran, many of whom you can see in this slide, that I worked with, so as this core group gradually dispersed to numerous countries around the world, either through repatriation to Afghanistan, onward migration, or resettlement to third countries via the United Nations, many found that social media became their primary way of staying in touch, both with other poets and also, well, not clearly with their friends, but also with wider Persian-speaking audiences and publics in general. So this allowed their poems to be published and read quickly, self-published, perhaps with less of that fear of official censorship, and for readers to give them comments and feedback, even if often the poets that I've spoken to often despair at how perfunctory some of the online feedback in comments under their poems can be compared to the sort of really rigorous grillings they would receive in face-to-face poetry workshops that I attended in Mashhad, for example. And many of the poets I first met in Iran now have very large followings on social media, numbering in the thousands. Those who still live in Iran often have Iranian followers as well. One of the most popular is Zahra Hossein-Zadeh, born in 1980, who's a master of the Ghazal form, who still lives in Iran and has a following among both Afghans and Iranians with over 24,000 followers last time I checked on Instagram. And the connections they make are not just about staying in touch with existing acquaintances, they also become powerful tools for finding and interacting with like-minded people, some of whom go on to become firm friends and result in sprawling transnational networks of poets, intellectuals, and other cultural producers. Now, to give you a sense of the scale and shape of these networks, I tried to do a little visualization of a poetic activity that I saw unfold on Facebook in early 2017. And this was a poetry challenge, a little bit like a chain email or something, which came to my attention because it popped up in the posts of people who were already in my network, essentially my friends, people from that core group that I started work with from my original study. But then I traced the challenge back to its originator, who I didn't know, an Afghan woman living in the Netherlands. And so her idea was that people should compose and share an original poem on their page and nominate 3 to 5 female poets to share some of their work too, and then to pass on the challenge like a chain letter. So I didn't manage to explore all the branches of this chain, which were multiplying exponentially, as you can imagine. People were, very keen to participate in this, actually. But those that I did trace are here. And so I've anonymized the poets, but the place names are real. And this will give you an idea of the global nature of these networks. So this was the originator, someone who lives in the Netherlands. And she sent this to a couple of people, 5 people in a variety of different countries. And then they, these were the ones that I could capture. Obviously, some people's Facebook pages are private, people I didn't know. I didn't want to dig too deep. I tried to stick to people that I did know or know of, and then they shared it onwards, and it just became this big web. But those, the colors only mean sort of the latest stages in the sharing in the chain. But here in red, I've marked out the people who had been part of the core group of poets that I knew in person in Mashhad during my initial fieldwork, many of whom then, as you can see, remigrated but stayed in touch. So what effect does such collapsing of space and time relative to older media such as print, what effect does it have on poetic circulation, on genres, on sort of temporalities, and all of these things I'm fascinated by and currently researching? I don't have the answers to all of these things. But one thing that's clear is that the internet facilitates this sort of immediacy, the temporal, again, the collapsing of time between when an event happens and when people respond to it poetically, which gives political poetry an added boost because you can sort of immediately speak your mind on some event, which obviously has a political dimension. And because Afghanistan has remained embroiled in conflict during the past 40 years, with periodic atrocities taking place on its soil, such as bombings, armed assaults against civilians by insurgent groups, and so on. It's important to remember that many of Afghanistan's Persian-speaking poets are Hazaras, Shias, or otherwise from ethnic groups which are in sympathy with these minority groups that have often been specifically targeted in such insurgent attacks. And so news of this bloodshed, complete with often very graphic images, makes its way onto the social media feeds of diasporic Afghans within minutes of such events, soon followed by anguished responses in verse that crystallize the feelings of many observers. They're a form of witnessing, but also sort of crystallizing an affective response among a wider group of people, a public, if you will. And, and so they're clearly read and appreciated and sort of, arouse powerful emotions in readers as well, because they receive dozens or hundreds of likes and shares on Facebook. This happens also on Twitter and Instagram as well, of course. So poetry, I think, is helping to galvanize this affective community very quickly because it's so quick to produce. And many of the poets I know are responding to this sort of collapsed temporality, perhaps, by growing increasingly skilled at impromptu composition. And of course, poetry is important in this cultural work because of the deep reserves of cultural and historical resonance on which it draws. So that brings me to the events of this past summer, which were no exception in this regard, and in fact resulted in an intensification of poetic activity. People were responding to events such as the fall of particular cities, or to images or particular news stories with new compositions, repostings of their older work on sort of relevant themes such as war and nostalgia for the homeland, or martyrdom in some cases, or quotes from famous works by other poets, which were also recognizable to the people in their networks. Many, both women and men, expressed their solidarity for the women of Afghanistan and fear of what a return to Taliban rule would mean for them. In early September 2021, when the province of Panjshir was the final region of Afghanistan mounting armed resistance against the Taliban, many Persian language poets, not just Panjshiri Tajiks, but others as well, returned to the tones and themes of the war and resistance poetry of the 1980s, praising the leaders of the resistance and lamenting those who were killed with a return to the language of martyrdom. Now, I'm going to turn now to the poetry of Mahbouba Ebrahimi, the third poet in, I don't think I have a new slide of her image here, but the third poet in the series of photos that I showed you earlier. Now, Mahbouba is a native of Kandahar, born in 1975, who grew up in Iran and has a degree in public health, is an award-winning poet who's published many books of poetry. She grew up listening to her grandmother's stories and reading the poetry of Hafez and Parvina Etesami, an early 20th century Iranian female poet, and trying her hand at writing her own poems from a young age. Living in Tehran, she and her husband were literary activists who published a cultural magazine and organized poetry gatherings and a highly popular festival of Afghan youth literature called Khand Parsi, the sweetness or sugar of Persian, which was held initially annually, but later semi-regularly in Tehran. Young women always had a strong presence at this festival and were very confident in presenting their poems on a diverse array of topics, in many years sweeping up most of the prizes, in fact, which was a major encouragement in their poetic careers. So when I first met her and interviewed her in Tehran in 2005, Mahbouba spoke with calm confidence of the growth of women's literature. She said, quote, "I'm certain that in 20 or 25 years, we will have a generation of female writers and poets in Afghanistan. And this, alongside all the difficulties of exile, is a blessing that has been given to us, that women have had space to breathe in a cultural environment like that of Iran, but based on our own cultural foundations. We hope to introduce ourselves to the world, to countries which only see the face of poverty of Afghanistan. However, from a cultural perspective, we are a rich people. We want to promote the face that is not seen in the world, to translate our work." 2 years later, in 2007, her first volume of poetry, Badha Khaharan Man and The Winds Are My Sisters, was published in Iran. And that same year, she returned to Afghanistan because, of course, I've pointed out many of the positives for the Afghan refugee community in Iran, but there were many negatives too, such as their inability to naturalize as citizens, despite having lived there for decades, many of them, or their families, and their inability to pursue many of their professions. In Iran, they legally are entitled to work in manual labor only. So there are lots of problems. There was pervasive poverty and periodic deportations and all kinds of issues that I, again, don't have time to explore in depth. But after her return to Afghanistan, soon Mahbouba became a refugee again, heading to Sweden to seek a better future for her young children. And she now lives in a tiny village north of Uppsala. And although geographically isolated from most of her compatriots, she is active on Facebook and Instagram and regularly shares her new work there. She was very prolific during this tense summer of 2021, posting many new poems and reposting old ones. And if I am going to sort of try to amplify her voice here, it's because she was probably one of the most prolific poets of these past few months that I encountered. Now, even in her previous works, she has often taken an anti-war stance and has many poems sort of dedicated to their homeland, which is typically personified as a character, as a personality in her poetry. In the past, for example, she's identified it with a loving but exhausted father or mother. And her poems from 2007 were full of hope that a return to Afghanistan would sort of make her whole again, would fill the missing pieces, that she would be able to sing and sort of write ghazals again, as she expressed it in one of her poems. And unfortunately, as we know, that perhaps remained a little bit illusory, and she felt obliged to remigrate when she really didn't feel that she could make a future for herself in Afghanistan. So cut to 2021 again, and this is the poem that sort of initially piqued my interest that she wrote back in July, when it was a little bit unclear which way things were going to go, but people were getting increasingly nervous about events in Afghanistan. So I'll just read the English. Take your bombs, your guns, and your trash. Clear out and go home, comfortable people of the world. Stop eyeing up our water and land, heartless neighbors. Mournful, enraged, these days, poetry can't work its poetry. Which woman has the heart to tend to her looks when she's anxious and distraught? A woman abandoned by all is not a woman. She is gunpowder stuffed down the throat of a gun, a sorrow petrified in a mountain's heart. How can I speak poetry with all this molten rock in my throat? We did not deserve war, homeland dear. Wild, beautiful woman, your fate could have been caravans bearing silk and light, the Robab's echoes in the mountains, Salang's snow, the Helmand's flow, and strong, kind men who gifted you children made of love and wisdom. Regret, exile, aloneness. I did not deserve these. My poems should have borne the scent of redbud and oleaster, the tinkle of anklets and attans, the tang of sheep's milk in green thickets. They'll grow green one day, all these dreams that we've buried in the breast of the earth. This poem was posted on Instagram on the 11th of July this year, and it reflects the anxiety with which many diasporic Afghans watched as international troops accelerated their withdrawal from Afghanistan that month, a concern that quickly turned to horror as the Taliban began to make increasingly rapid territorial gains across the country. Most Afghan people wanted foreign military occupation to end, certainly, but this was too fast, too uncontrolled, and the outcome not at all what many had hoped for. And again, here she's personifying her homeland, but this time as a wild, beautiful woman who deserved a different, happier fate. She denounces both Westerners and Afghanistan's immediate neighbors for their hand in its decades of misery, all the while mourning the beauty of her homeland and its deferred dreams. As more cities fell, next came the news of the desperate and chaotic evacuations of Afghan citizens allied with the foreign forces, the government, or otherwise perceiving themselves at risk from the Taliban. The chaos and haste were epitomized by several reports of women giving birth on board evacuation flights. In response to such stories, Mahbouba posted the following poem on Facebook on the 31st of August, that significant date, reflecting, as she often does, the plight of refugees and exiles everywhere. We don't have much space on this earth of ours, the extent of a room, the extent of a rug. We don't even have enough time for our final death throes. So we have to give birth to our babies on airplanes, breastfeed them in camps, and hear them speak their first words in the lands of others. And one day they'll suddenly ask us, where are we from? We have to be very careful not to burn their delicate fingertips on a map when we place them over the homeland's name. That's one of my favorites, actually. I think it's makes me quite emotional. So what can this poetry tell us about the perspectives of Afghan women in the wake of the fall of Kabul? In its simplest form, it's a way of documenting one's reactions to events, of witnessing. For those poets, writers, and cultural activists who fled, and those looking on from outside the country, the return of the Taliban represented the overnight extinguishing of their lives and achievements, as well as the dreams of a peaceful, democratic, rights-respecting, and ethnically harmonious Afghanistan, to whose realization many had dedicated their lives. As I've written elsewhere, writing poetry can be an act of release or personal catharsis for the poet, a purging of one's dard daruni, or inner pain. It's simultaneously an act of self-making as an engaged and an empathetic intellectual, and an act of witnessing a collective pain and claiming the right to voice it. Afghan women's poetry of the last 20 years has told a story of hope and despair, but above all of creativity and innovation that, thanks to the virtual networks of social media and its ease of transmission, refuses more than ever to be suppressed. So the life of Mahbouba Ebrahimi, meanwhile, shows us both the ongoing mobility of Afghan cultural figures, but also the enduring and intense entanglement of their lives with their homeland, no matter how many borders they've crossed over the years. Their poetic subjectivities are complex and nuanced, with diverse sources of inspiration from across the Persian-speaking world, but also, for those who now speak other languages, from other literary traditions too, but that's definitely the subject for another talk. Although the state of refuginess or exile often implies a state of exception, in this region, on the contrary, mobility, whether due to pastoral nomadism, trade, pilgrimage, scholarship, or indeed political exile, has been a fact of life for centuries. The rise of a centralized state of Afghanistan, with irredentist populations straddling its imperially imposed borders, should in many ways be seen as more exceptional and requiring greater cultural and political negotiation that is far from complete today. Indeed, numerous scholars have shown that diasporic individuals and communities themselves have played an important role in the imagination of the Afghan state and its national culture and literature, whether in the 19th century or in the 21st. Recently, scholars of Afghan literature in Persian and Pashto, such as James Caron and Fatemeh Shams, have been finding it fruitful to write instead, not necessarily of poetry of exile, literature of exile, or refugee literature, but of border or borderland literatures, drawing inspiration from poets and theorists of the Mexican-American borderlands, such as Heriberto Yepes and Gloria Anzaldúa. And here, as James Caron writes, quote, migrant subjects and plural local ones, both in the literary formation and in everyday life, are not separable in a trans-regional society that's been configured as a global borderland. Theirs is a combined social and aesthetic practice that negotiates bordering and that reconstitutes new formations out of the fragments that result from it, end quote. So I think that this description of sort of borderland literatures and borderland subjectivities fits the profile of all of the Afghan refugee poets that I worked with in Iran, who then went on either to return to Afghanistan or to move to other places, but sort of remained in the orbit of the homeland with all of these multiple sort of lines and borders riven into their very personalities, their subjectivities, and trying to deal with that and to negotiate that constantly. And you can see a little bit of that in these poems. I think I have to close now, and I hope I may not have answered all the questions that I posed, but hopefully it will have sparked enough questions in you that you can then force me to answer things that I may have eschewed earlier. But I will leave us with another poem by Mahbouba, which she shared on Facebook earlier this year, I think in the spring, before anyone had any inkling of what was going to happen, but revealing clearly a process of both gradual cutting of ties with many aspects of her previous identity, but also, again, this ongoing pull of the homeland, this perpetual orbit that she was in, and kind of the remaking of her personality and subjectivity in interesting ways while retaining something of what it used to be. And I'll show you what I mean now. I used to think the fragrant mouth of love, the strong arms of faith, and the warm embrace of my homeland would save me. Now I'm grateful to love for finding better prey, taking its teeth off my throat and allowing me to breathe in the scent of the pine trees. However hard I tried, I couldn't find a place in the arms of faith. The harem was big, I was wild, and I couldn't wait my turn for lovemaking. I was afraid of being stoned. I broke the locks and fled. But my homeland is still my mother, who sold all her wedding gold to buy me a plane ticket so I could go and stay alive. One day, without love, without faith, just for my mother's sake, I will return. Thank you.